Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. The topic of this episode of my podcast is race in the head of the beast, the United States. What this lecture will basically be about is a restatement of many of the points that I used to make, especially in my social problems classes before I retired, when I would discuss the subject of race, but also I would mention them in my introduction to sociology classes too, although in a somewhat different way. So this is basically a kind of introduction to race from a sociological perspective, but really a kind of critical or Marxist sociological perspective, one that many people do not hear that much about. There has been a lot of discussion in recent years and controversy on the American right concerning critical race theory. This is not critical race theory. Critical race theory originated in law schools, and it dealt specifically or deals specifically with the legal aspects of race, especially things like Jim Crow laws and what some people have called the new Jim Crow. For example, in general, voting rights of African Americans, but more broadly, the ways in which African Americans have been treated by the law enforcement system. This perspective in sociology might include some of that, but it is much older than critical race theory. We have been discussing race in sociology for a very long time. And so my knowledge of critical race theory is very limited because I am not a legal scholar. I do not have a law degree. I have a PhD in sociology and an MA in sociology and a bachelor's in journalism and an associate's in English, but nothing in law. So I'm not really qualified to discuss law from, say, a constitutional perspective. So this will be strictly limited to race viewed from a sociological perspective, or as some have put it, through a sociological lens. First of all, what I would ordinarily say, and I'll just say it very upfront here, there is no such thing as race. Objectively, biologically, genetically, race simply does not exist. It is a fabrication. It is a lie. It has no reality to it whatsoever. The only reality that one could argue that race has is a socially constructed one. And because that reality is only socially constructed, the way in which we view race right here in the US has changed over and over again. So we will come back to that. But if race is not real, or using critical realist terms, I guess we might say if race is demi-reality, then what is real? What is real are races, or the concept of race as a genetic factor. For example, the the fact that people from different parts of the world have different eye colors, different shades of skin, different hair colors. Some people in parts of the world have an extra fold on the eye. For example, in North and South Asia, parts of North and South Asia, as a protection against dust. The the heavier skin and eyes and hair is a protection against the sun. And so all of these can be attributed to issues of climate, natural selection, people who had the natural racial factors that were most likely to survive in a particular area lived long enough to reproduce. So there is a very close connection between the idea of racial categories or racial activity or race from a genetic or biological perspective and evolution. Race can be seen as real only from the standpoint of evolution, but races, the fact that we talk about different races, there is no validity to that from a sociological or a biological or a genetic perspective whatsoever. It is purely a social fiction. But as a social fiction, once it has been constructed, socially constructed, it has created a terrifying reality. And that reality is oppression for broad segments of the American population. So, how did different races begin? Meaning, if there is no such thing as race, if race is simply a result of issues of climate, and people with different types of physical characteristics survived and others did not survive, then where did the notion of different races come from? Give you a couple of seconds. Slavery, the plantation system. Race was created on the plantations in the United States. In the United States, race is entirely an issue of slavery. Why? Well, what many scholars have argued is that at some point on many plantations in the US, some slave owners, commonly addressed as master and mistress, kind of offensive, isn't it? Approached the rednecks on their plantations. Now, the term redneck, for anybody who does not know, is not an offensive term to rednecks. People who are rednecks in the South, and I say that as somebody who has spent a major portion of my life living in the South, do not regard the word redneck as a pejorative. Redneck is a friendly term. Rednecks call themselves rednecks. Redneck today refers to a white person who likes to hunt, who likes to fish, who maybe believes in some conspiracy theories, who is most likely political right wing, who may support these days Donald Trump, and who likely lives, if not in a trailer park, in a place that is roughly the same from an economic perspective as a trailer park. So the person might as well live in a trailer park. So that's basically what a redneck is. Right here where I am in Deep South Texas, this is not the Deep South. Deep South Texas is not the Deep South. The Deep South refers to places like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Arkansas, and Western Tennessee. Those and a few other places may be categorized as the Deep South. This area is predominantly Mexican American, so it is not the Deep South in any way that I would relate to it as somebody who has lived in the Deep South for a long time. This place is not the Deep South. So I am not currently living in such place, but I can relate to it. I have known many rednecks, and not all rednecks are bigots today. In fact, some rednecks have many black friends and even go on parties with black friends. There are even, surprisingly today, some African Americans who call themselves rednecks because they share the redneck culture, especially the gun culture, which is one of the major defining characteristics of being a redneck in the 21st century. So, rednecks back in the 19th century and earlier, when slavery was the dominant economic system in the South, rednecks were poor. And as poor people, they were basically on the same economic level as the black slaves. But here's what some scholars have suggested. Certain of these mistresses or masters went to some rednecks and said, look, you and I have a lot in common. We are both English. Back in those days, white people were of English ancestry. The term white became a more encompassing label later on, but a white person back then was somebody of English ancestry. So we are both of English ancestry. Those slaves out there, they're not. They're African. They have nothing in common with us. We, on the other hand, have a lot in common, and we should become allies. And so at that point, the plantation owners offered these rednecks a deal. The deal was that in exchange for the rednecks becoming effectively the foreman on the plantations, supervising the black slaves, in turn, the rednecks would get certain rights, more money, more property, and perhaps even the right to represent themselves in court. Yes, at one time, you did not, even if you were white, have the right to represent yourself in court. So these plantation owners could actually give their rednecks that right. Sounds kind of hard to imagine today, but things were quite different back then. The police officers were basically allies with the plantation owners, as has generally been the case and is still the case in much of the world. The police function as defenders of the powerful, not as defenders of the powerless. So, Black Lives Matter. What many people argued, including the three women who originally started the Twitter, now X, hashtag BLM or Black Lives Matter, their husbands were innocent men who were unjustifiably killed by the police. Later, BLM became the blacklivesmatter.com website, and they were trying to create a sense of consciousness among African Americans as to what we can do. Sadly, at least to me, it seems as though the BLM movement has all but died out. I very rarely hear about it anymore. If there is some activity, I don't know about it, and I am very sad about that. BLM, I thought, could become a new civil rights movement. I was a part of the first one back in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and I said, maybe we will see a revival of it. It does not seem that if there was such a revival that it lasted very long. So the police are still killing innocent black women and men. Innocent black women and men. Before police cams, what police would commonly do is they would kill a black person, then plant a gun next to that person, and then say, well, see, this person was going to kill me. Entirely fabricated. And the police got away with it because nobody would testify against a police officer. Even now, police officers charged with murder very commonly are found not guilty. Why? Because they're police officers. And most people, including most Americans, have tremendous respect for police officers. They are not critical. They are not judgmental. They are not fair when it comes to the treatment of police officers who kill innocent people compared to an average civilian who does the same thing. I think that's pretty common knowledge these days. It is sad, but it has been going on for a long time. I had a friend who was killed by a police officer, a black man who was killed by a white police officer. This white police officer was never even arrested and was back on the force the next day. That is all too common in the United States. So you have this system in the South primarily, which is controlled by the plantation owners and supported by political officials and, yes, by police officers. And now these plantation owners were reaching out to the rednecks and saying, we will bring you in to some degree. You can be a part of our in-group. Maybe before you were in the out-group, but now we'll make you one of us. Why? Because you are white. That was the beginning of whiteness. It wasn't called whiteness back then, but it might as well have been. That's when whiteness began in the United States. It began in the plantations, primarily in the South, in the southern states of the United States. So, if you were a poor person and somebody came to you with an offer like that, would you accept it? I don't know whether you would. I would hope I wouldn't, but how can I know? I'm not in that situation. I might have. I know, for example, that my parents, who in a very similar situation prior to World War II as Ashkenazi Jews, were not defined as being white. But after World War II, suddenly the canopy of whiteness was broadened to include them, Italians, Irish, Poles, and others. And my parents and others willingly accepted it. And they began to define themselves as white people as well, something which I have very vociferously rejected. I call myself a brown person of color. I mean, if my Arab brothers and sisters are brown persons of color and they are Semitic like me, then why should I not be a brown person of color too? So I have rejected that label. I have rejected that social construction because ultimately, person of color, white person, they are simply social constructions. They have no reality. Races have no reality whatsoever. But despite that, the results produced by them definitely do have a reality. The creation of the powerful redneck, the redneck as a foreman, was one of them. The creation of Jim Crow was another. There are countless examples of the effect that this imaginary idea of races has had on the popular mind of the American people. And none of those has been very good or very beneficial for people of color in the United States, especially for African Americans, but not exclusively for African Americans. In general, people of color in the United States have been treated very, very badly, very, very badly. And Jews were at one time, in effect, people of color too, even though that term was not used. Irish, Italians were also people of color, again, even though that term was not used. So you had this construction of whiteness, which included the plantation owners, the masters and mistresses, and the rednecks. And the rednecks, even though they had much more in common economically with the slaves than they did with the plantation owners, willingly accepted their incorporation into this club of whiteness. Can one blame them? In a way not. I mean, I can understand it. I do think that what they did is blameworthy, but I think if I were in their situation, I don't know whether I would accept it. All I can say is I hope I would not, but I have no way of knowing, and neither can anyone. We are not in that situation. All I can say is that as an anti-racist, I hope that if I were offered that kind of privilege, I would turn away and reject it immediately. My parents did not. Now, did they think of the implications of it? No, but they accepted it. They didn't fight it. I really didn't consider fighting it either until after I became a sociologist and was aware of the implications of Jews having been incorporated into this canopy of whiteness. Very, very unfortunate situation, but it arose because of the invention of slavery in the way it was practiced in the United States. And so if you were not a slave, then the only thing you could be without being a redneck is a white person. And so Black people became the other major social construction. You were either Black or you were white. That is the way things remained for a long time. Now race has become somewhat more complex, so Black has kind of been replaced by people of color, with multiple categories of people of color under that. But regardless, it's the same basic thing. It is an oppressive construction which exists to advance the interests of a certain population, white people, against the interests of another. And so historically, the most conservative members of white society have resisted all attempts at reform, all attempts at changing the system. Why? Because the system benefits them. It is advantageous. There is no reason for them to fight to change the system. Anyone who does that is an upstart, is a radical, or perhaps even, like me, a revolutionary, a label that I proudly wear. But most people in the US are not upstarts, reformists, or revolutionaries when it comes to race. Most people are content to just sit back and watch their lives go by, do their jobs, take care of their families, and simply not worry that much about the affairs of the oppressed people in this country. Most Americans, in other words, are not actively anti-racist. Now, they may say, if asked, do you support racism? Most people would say no. But what does it mean not to support racism? Nothing. It means absolutely nothing. What matters is to become, as I said, an anti-racist, somebody who actively works for the elimination of racism in the United States, something that I saw happening in BLM, but sadly have not seen in several years. I hope it gets revived by something, but I am not that hopeful. The capitalist class, as Antonio Gramsci said, which has the power to mold ideology, seems to have successfully shifted the focus for most Americans off the issue of race once again. And so as people of color suffer in poverty, disproportional poverty compared to white people, nobody these days seems to care. Nobody seems to care. So, again, races as social constructions are not real, but their consequences are real. Race in a general sense, meaning genetics, biology, sure, that's real. We are all the products of the climate that we grew up in. But here's the problem with that. We define race in the United States and in some other countries as well, based primarily on skin pigmentation and secondarily on the eye fold. We don't consider hair color. We don't consider eye color. Why not? The answer is there is no answer. Or really, to be more precise, the answer is history, because hair color and eye color were not issues on the plantations. They didn't matter. If they were, we might today be talking about the brown-eyed race, the black-eyed race, the whatever, the green-eyed race, the blonde-haired race, the brown-haired race, etc. But we don't. Is there any legitimacy to that from a biological or genetic perspective? No. There are certain parts of the world which have a higher concentration of people with certain skin pigmentations, eye colors, hair colors, and eye folds. And you can distinguish parts of the world based upon those characteristics. But if those characteristics don't matter, as they don't, except in a joking sense, when people say, I want to marry a blonde, which is really just, aside from being sexist, is just basically somebody making an attempt at a joke, a bad joke, but a joke nonetheless. If we have a situation like that, where those things simply don't matter, then it simply becomes like that, a joke. But what if they did? What if they did? And what if skin pigmentation did not matter? What if the eye fold did not matter? Then we would see races of people based upon skin color or eye color. And people would select their marriage partners based upon whether their skin color or eye color is similar to their own. That's exactly what would happen. It's the same chemicals that produce all of those things: skin color, eye color, hair color. The same chemicals produce all of them. It is simply an accident of history, which has resulted in the kind of disgusting situation that we are in right now, where all of a sudden we are living in a world, especially here in the United States, where skin color dominates everything. You can predict the success or lack of success of a person based on their skin pigmentation. Fortunately, somewhat less than before, but still, skin color is a major predictor of social class, a major predictor of social class. Is hair color a predictor? Is eye color a predictor? No. Is the eye fold a predictor? To a lesser extent, but it's way, 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 way down. Not a major factor at all. So we have a situation where, yes, there is such a thing as race. It's simply a genetic characteristic based upon climate, but races, which are simply accidental products of climate differences, have taken on a reality which, in fact, they do not have. And so, what is the task of the true Maoist third worldist revolutionary? What is our task? Well, part of it, I think, is looking around the world and observing that the problems that we have with race right here are not limited to the United States. There are problems with race in many other countries too. And where there are not racial problems, there are tribal problems or caste problems. Tribe and caste, like race, is a social construction, meaning tribe and caste have no ultimate reality either. Purely socially constructed realities, which means they are not realities. They have no basis in reality, and yet they are considered as being realities. When I was in Central Africa, in Congo, when I was in Kinshasa, the capital of Congo, I remember going there and immediately being called a European. And I said to the person, "Oh, no, I'm not a European. I'm from the United States." And the person said, "Well, then you're a European." Okay, what was I going to do? I mean, that was their categorization system. The the interesting thing about that, I guess you could say it's a sad thing, um, during the civil rights movement, back, say, in the 1950s and 1960s, especially, many African Americans went to Africa hoping to find some degree of solidarity with Africans, with Black Africans, hoping that these Black Africans would accept them as Africans as well. In most cases, they did not. Instead, they also saw them as Europeans. Why? Because they had no tribe. So, what made me a European and not an American, because those things are not really important in Congo, what made me a European was the fact that I had no tribe. And so, if an African American, as we define African American here, went to Africa, that person was also regarded as being a European. So we see how varied these concepts are. In approaching the issue then of race and racial construction, one needs to be sensitive not only to the ways in which race is defined here, but to the ways in which race is defined in the countries one is dealing with, and in some cases to the fact that other countries, places like Pakistan, like Afghanistan, like Africa, like India, have no concept of race. Instead, they talk about tribe and caste. And so we need to be aware of those things because those are the factors which divide people in those parts of the world, just as race divides us here and in some other parts of the world too, not only in the United States. Canada, Britain, many other countries are defined by race, although it may not be exactly the same as it is here. There is still a kind of racial division in much of the world, but not everywhere. So we need to understand what kinds of divisions exist throughout the world, especially in the third world and in the fourth world, so that when we try to practice conscientization, critical conscience, and consciousness raising, we are aware of the people that we are talking with and the kinds of divisions that they have. So we are addressing the problems that they experience and not simply projecting our own inequalities and our own forms of oppression on them. For the time being, this has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Metarealism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.